Good evening, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here at the University of Melbourne. I would like to thank Dean Willis for hosting this lecture and Kim Dovey and Crystal Legacy for the invitation. I'm also grateful to the many staff who have made possible the various details of this visit. And after so many years of reading the rich urban studies ideas and frameworks that have emanated from this university, I'm thrilled to be here to give this public lecture, but also during this week to learn. My talk this evening begins to build a new line of inquiry concerned with the city as post-colony. I'm especially interested in the relationship between property and personhood as foundational to colonial power and the afterlives of colonialism. As you will notice this evening, running through the talk is a concept that I've been developing for a few years, first on the south side of Chicago and now in Los Angeles, a concept that I call racial banishment. So let us start with the City of Angels, Los Angeles, my home. Just a few weeks ago, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, in order to express his concern about growing homelessness, visited an unhoused woman, Chriselle, who lives in a dirt embankment in North Hollywood, a neighborhood of modest incomes, but one that is rapidly gentrifying. Accompanied by outreach workers who were handing out information about city services, the mayor stated, I quote, "One of the things that's kind of magical as mayor is that sometimes I can make the difference of whether somebody will say, 'Today is the day I'll actually come off the streets.'" A few hours after the mayor's visit, one of the journalists happened to return to the embankment. City workers were conducting what is called a sweep, sweeping up and destroying the personal property of unhoused residents. This included the shopping carts that belonged to Chriselle, which contained her ID, medicine, cell phone, food, and clothes. She said, "Everything I own is gone again." Chriselle's story is not an anomaly. The city of Los Angeles deploys vast public resources to systematically confiscate and destroy the personal property of the unhoused. It is estimated that this year, in 2019, the city will spend $30 million on these sweeps alone. Indeed, a broader picture shows that the city spends about $100 million a year on responding to homelessness, 90% of which is spent by the Los Angeles Police Department to enforce laws that criminalize poverty. The process is best understood, I would argue, as spatial illegalization, and it is enabled through a very specific legal mechanism in which planners play an important role, the Municipal Ordinance. This is the legal production of illegality, a phrase I borrow from border studies scholar Nicholas de Genova and his analysis of migrant illegality and deportability. In the case of municipal ordinances, legal reason and legal authority render homelessness, as a state of being, illegal. Not surprisingly, such legal reason is bound up with discourses that vilify the houseless for creating a city of filth and disease. A recent opinion piece by one of LA City Council members blamed typhus, which he described as a medieval disease, on homelessness. He lamented that the rats have spread from the tents of the homeless to City Hall. In Los Angeles, the ordinance behind the sweeps is LAMC 5611, which limits the ownership of personal property by an unhoused person to a 60-gallon trash bag, the dimensions of the trash bags used by the city's sanitation department, which conducts the sweeps, and authorizes a whole range of city workers to seize and destroy so-called excess property of the unhoused. In addition, the ordinance criminalizes any effort by the unhoused to resist such destruction or to even hold on to property that has been tagged for destruction. In San Francisco, where similar forms of state-organized violence are at work, a coalition between homelessness advocacy groups and radical artists, a project called Stolen Belonging, and I urge you to go to the website of Stolen Belonging and look at the work they're doing, including the videos they produce. This collaboration very poignantly and appropriately frames the city itself as thief, talking about the various ways in which there is the constant theft of the personal belongings of the unhoused. I start with these examples because what is at stake here are important questions about property and personhood, or what Nicholas Blomley has called enactment of property. In a well-known essay, Jane Barron defined homelessness not in relation to poverty, but rather in relation to property. She said homelessness is the legal category of no property. Under conditions of what I have earlier termed property citizenship, we can argue then that the unhoused have no place to own anything at all, or to place what they own in space. They cannot claim the constitutional protections of property that are afforded to propertied citizens. Indeed, they have no right to exist at all. The legal category of no property, then, is not just a biopolitical category. It is not just about the management of life. It is a necropolitical category. This is about the politics of life and death. So, the life expectancy of an unhoused woman in Los Angeles today is 48 years. The life expectancy of an unhoused man in Los Angeles today is 51 years. LAMC 5611 was passed by the City Council in 2016 in the wake of a lawsuit brought by 4 houseless individuals and 2 important community organizations, including the Los Angeles Community Action Network, or LACAN. Keep LACAN in mind, we'll come back to LACAN a few times this evening. LACAN has been working in the heart of Skid Row for over 20 years. This landmark lawsuit, Mitchell versus the City of Los Angeles, which Shayla Myers of the Legal Aid Foundation of LA as the key lawyer, sued the city for the illegal seizure and destruction of homeless people's property. The complaint tells the story of the lead plaintiff, Carl Mitchell, a 62-year-old Skid Row resident who had faced many displacements, including the shuttering of various shelters where he had lived. On a winter night in Los Angeles, officers of the police department seized his 2 shopping carts. They also cited and arrested him for possession of a shopping cart that didn't belong to him, but that was simply in his proximity. The cart and all of his property were destroyed, including his ID and medicines. He was released in the middle of the night from the police station without any charges filed, but with none of his belongings except the clothes he was wearing, a pair of shoelaces, and a belt. As the lawsuit asserted, such daily acts of state-organized violence criminalize poverty and are violations of constitutional protections, including protection against unreasonable seizure, the 4th Amendment of the US Constitution, and the right to due process, the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. Mitchell versus Los Angeles led to a preliminary injunction and most recently a legal settlement that such sweeps cannot take place within Skid Row. And it's important because it asserts the property rights and due process rights of the houseless. It is an example of how spatial illegalization is the terrain of fierce mobilization and struggle in Los Angeles. And I'll return to this point later in my talk. For now, what I want to emphasize is the relationship between houseless personhood and rightlessness. The hinge of that relationship is the category of property. And I'll soon outline how and why I want us to think about property in relation to the present history of colonialism. But while property gets a great deal of attention in urban studies, personhood is less often the ground of theorization. Yet my argument is precisely that the two are deeply entangled. Libby Porter thus asks a vitally important question, thinking from Australia. For what is to become of those who cannot prove their worth across the thresholds of recognition? As she goes on to argue, if a possessory logic dominates all claims of recognition, then who are the social subjects excluded from what she calls possessory recognizability? One example of this comes from yet another legal category on which my recent work focuses, which is the category of nuisance. In collaboration with Tara Graziani, my ongoing research in Los Angeles examines how nuisance abatement serves as the public means of dispossession, or what I call racial banishment. But let's first take a closer look at nuisance in the context of Delhi. Two magisterial books, one by Gautam Bhan and the other by Asher Gertner, lays out the growing role of legal reason and legal authority in mass evictions. Once again, what is at work is spatial illegalization, the rendering illegal of large swaths of informal habitation. In Rule by Aesthetics, Asher Gertner shows how in the early 2000s in Delhi, there was a large increase in public interest litigations filed by resident welfare associations, so homeowner associations, mobilized around quality of life and neighborhood security issues. Such litigation pushed the courts to rule on what is and is not a public nuisance. Reviving the use of nuisance during British colonialism, a new legal regime pinpointed and removed informal settlements that looked dirty and unruly. There is, of course, the question of what Kim Dovey and Ross King have framed as the visibility and image of the informal sector under, in their words, the formal gaze of the city. In Delhi, as Gertner shows, the politics of visibility was quickly folded into the politics of personhood. As he notes, individuals or groups themselves came to be considered a public nuisance. So a distinction was drawn between city residents who were seen to own private property and those who were not considered to be residents, those who were seen to be slum dwellers, a secondary category of citizens, and those that were themselves a public nuisance. Gertner calls this the propriety of property, a concept that I find to be very useful. Similarly, in the public's interest, Gautam Bhan argues that this new urban legal regime in India articulated illegality not as a particular act, not as a particular use of land, but as personhood itself. The courts shifted their language of encroachment from the act of encroachment to the figure of the encroacher. And the encroacher, as Bhan argues, came to be seen as the antithesis of citizen, unworthy of rights. The effects of such a legal regime have been devastating, as it has been in Los Angeles. Bhan's book starts with the case of the settlement of Pushta, where in 2004, hundreds of armed police demolished homes and evicted 150,000 people. This is Pushta before, this is Pushta after. It is important to emphasize the role of legal reason and legal authority, the deployment of these key legal categories of property and personhood in such erasure. As Bhan emphasizes, contemporary evictions have happened through democratic processes, especially through the judiciary. In the case of Los Angeles, where it is estimated that 1,000 unhoused people died on the streets in 2018, one can amend that statement to say that contemporary death takes place through democratic processes. But it's also important to repeat something that those of us who work on urban informality often emphasize, and Kim mentioned this in his opening remarks. Spatial illegalization targets the informalities of the urban poor, of racial outsiders, but not the informalities of the rich and wealthy and the powerful, or what I call elite informalities. In fact, state practices, including urban planning, often valorize and legalize elite informalities. So Gertner thus shows that while the Pushta settlement was criminalized and illegalized, other developments on the same floodplain of the Yamuna River, notably the Akshardham temple, which is the largest Hindu monument in the world, was never pinpointed as an encroachment, which it is. We can take this a step further. I've already argued that US cities are seeing a proliferation of municipal ordinances that criminalize poverty. But these municipal ordinances also do something else. They criminalize innocent behavior taking place in space and place. So take, for example, another Los Angeles municipal ordinance, LAMC 8502. It's a municipal ordinance that prohibits living in your car. Through elaborate maps, because really the houseless are on their computers perusing city websites to figure out maps, the city has created a massive system of spatial illegalization, allowing living in your car only in the areas marked in green zones, most of which are already tied up in a whole set of parking restrictions and permits. Recently renewed by City Council in a unanimous vote, the ordinance is especially cruel since it comes at a time of swelling houselessness and targets the one form of shelter which the unhoused have a modicum of control over, which is their car. A few years ago, the city had tried to pass a similar ordinance, and a court ruling had struck it down, with the judge stating that the ban criminalized innocent behavior, such as sleeping in one's car or eating in one's car. That ruling noted that the ban was, I quote, incompatible with the concept of an even-handed administration of the law to the poor and rich that is fundamental to a democratic society. Spatial illegalization is thus inherently arbitrary and discriminatory. It also takes place at multiple scales. In this era of renewed white nationalism, I would be remiss if I did not point out that such bans, zones, and borders are being enacted at not only the urban scale, but also at the scale of the nation-state. In a forthcoming essay in Antipode, Nicholas de Genova and I draw attention to state practices of illegalization that are aimed not only at refugee and migrant mobility, but also the rights and claims of minoritized citizens. Building on de Genova's concept of the legal production of illegality, we show how minoritized citizens can be stripped of legal personhood and thus refigured as illegal. In the United States, immigration law, wedded with racial terror, is an obvious example. Take also the case of the government of India, which under Narendra Modi has taken measures to strip approximately 4 million people of their citizenship and their legal personhood in the northeastern state of Assam, with the stated aim of identifying, I quote, illegal Bangladeshi migrants branded by the Modi regime as infiltrators. These efforts include an updated national register of citizens from which so-called foreigners have been purged and now need to produce the documents to reassert their personhood and citizenship. Situated in the northeast part of India, Assam has long been a border zone, one where minoritized citizens, notably Bengali Muslims, have always been under suspicion, and migrants from Bangladesh have always been subject to expulsion. The two categories have often been collapsed onto one another. In Assam, this history stretches back to the British Empire, which recruited and relied on migrant workers to labor in its tea plantations. It is now being re-articulated through racial formations of Hindu nationalism that persistently vilify Bengali Muslims as foreign encroachers and even as terrorists. So these are border-making practices that are not limited to national borders. And these are legal practices that are absolutely crucial to the making and working of various forms of constitutions of liberal democracy. They show the ways in which liberal democracies rely on police power and rely on what Paul Gilroy called the racial terror that lies at the very heart of modernity. It relies also on exceptions and immunity, which is a key part of the logics of informality and illegality. So with this in mind, I want to turn to this concept which has been taking center place in my work over the last few years, racial banishment. While quite a bit of scholarship in urban studies emphasizes market-driven displacement, I'm interested in the role of state-organized violence against targeted bodies and communities. And I argue that this state-organized violence is foundational to market rule. Increasingly dissatisfied with our analytical vocabulary of gentrification, or even that of displacement, I view banishment as a form of disappearance, one that exceeds displacement through its effect of civil death, or what has been called social death, or racialized rightlessness. Pete White, founder of the LA CAN, that organization that I asked you to keep in mind, movement leader extraordinaire, thus insists on the terminology of banishment to talk about black houselessness in Los Angeles. Banishment, he notes, is when you have no other place to go. And sometimes Pete will add, when you have no other place to go, no other place than death or prison. In a city such as Los Angeles, there are many sedimented histories of banishment, from the elimination of native people, to the repatriation of Mexican citizens, to Japanese internment, to urban renewal. Today's banishment, as Herbert and Beckett have shown, uses legal tools, such as gang injunctions and nuisance abatement, to evict and push working-class communities of color to the far edges of urban life. But banishment is also a transnational geography of dispossession. As Ilana Zilberg writes, I quote, "The Central American barrio in Los Angeles is haunted with voices from those banished to El Salvador." Banishment is thus closely related to what Susan Couton has called dismemberment, which is both injury to migrant bodies and the erasure, or at least the attempted erasure, of memory. At the heart of racial banishment is the relationship between property, personhood, and police. By police, I mean the protection of propertied interests, but I also mean what Nikhilpal Singh has called the whiteness of police. Singh, like other theorists of whiteness, such as Cheryl Harris and George Lipsitz, conceptualizes whiteness as a status conferring distinct social, political, and economic freedoms across an unequal property order. Whiteness, he emphasizes, does not issue directly from private property. Rather, it emerges from the governance of property and its interests in relationship to those who have no property and who are therefore imagined to harbor a potentially criminal relationship with property. The whiteness of property and the whiteness of police, Singh argues, is a crucial method for regulating an unequal world and an unequal city. Put another way, racial banishment is a necessary piece of these forms of whiteness. So let me then lay out the theoretical and political stakes of this conceptual framework. Why does it matter for us to think about spatial illegalization and racial banishment? Why does it matter to foreground the relationship between property, personhood, and police in an understanding of urban inequality? In recent years, urban studies has seen what has been called a sudden turn, responding to the sharp critiques that many of us have advanced of Eurocentrism, of parochialism, of epistemological domination. Urban studies scholarship has taken on the task of thinking from the South, from the global South. While I celebrate this sudden turn, I also worry that it can reinscribe the exceptionalism of the West. As Erin McElroy and Alex Wirth have recently argued, the Southern turn has very usefully demonstrated the limited applicability of terms such as gentrification to postcolonial contexts. But by the same token, as they argue, it has possibly reified the use of these terms in the analysis of North Atlantic urbanism. They note that such theorizations obscure historical difference in the West and thus produce, in their words, deracinated dispossessions or accounts of displacement uprooted from grounded histories of racial violence and resistance. Put another way, the reworlding of urban studies that many of us called for throughout our careers is not simply a project of foregrounding colonial relationalities in the global South. It is also the task of resituating the cities of the global North in the long history of racial capitalism, including slavery, settler colonialism, and imperialism. So following Derek Gregory, who in turn is following Edward Said, I see this as interrogating and shifting the stories that the West tells itself about itself. Property is one of those stories. The law is another one of those stories. Also at stake here is what Tariq Jazil, in his recent critique of theories of planetary urbanization, has called the knowledge object of urban studies. He notes that urban studies scholars spend a lot of their lives studying quite familiar knowledge objects, the city, the urban. And he argues that we have to be attentive to what he calls other socio-spatial formations at large in multiple modernities, the spatial configurations for which we might not have the analytical vocabulary just yet. For me, the postcolony is one such socio-spatial formation. My use of the term postcolony for the lecture tonight, rather than our much more familiar term, the city, is meant to connote the ontological multiplicity that Jazil calls for. It is also meant to shift the stories the West tells itself about itself. I borrowed the idea of postcolony from the writings of Achille Mbembe, who relates the term postcolony to a whole series of other socio-spatial formations: the ghetto, the reservation, the prison, the plantation. And of course, in her landmark essay, Plantation Futures, Catherine McKittrick asks us to consider the plantation as a conceptual palimpsest to contemporary cityscapes that continue to harbor the lives of the most marginalized. I find McKittrick's methodology of palimpsest to be deeply inspiring, much more so than those of precedent, blueprint, template. Palimpsest, with its meanings and practices of erasure, overlay, reuse, seems just right. Now, I don't have time this evening to lay out Mbembe's ideas on the postcolony and their implications for a remaking of urban studies. Let me just say that the title of my talk, Property is Simulacrum, is borrowed also from a key idea in Mbembe's theorization of the post-colony, where he says at the heart of the violence of the post-colony is simulacrum. It's baroque, it's grotesque, it's intimate. So what does it mean to think about property as the simulacrum that anchors the post-colony? How do we keep in view this relationship between property, personhood, and police that I've been talking about all evening? How do we think about how this relationship ensures possession? Here, I think it's vitally important for us to consider the contributions of indigenous studies and histories of settler colonialism. Brenna Bhandar, for example, emphasizes what she describes as the immense significance of possession as a ruling concept. Alyosha Goldstein notes that it is legal reason that has built proprietary regimes underpinning settlement as an entitled and possessive relationship to place and casting indigenous populations as unsettled. Possession, he notes, must be understood not as preceding dispossession, but rather as its effect. A brilliant example of such a genealogy of possession comes in the work of Kesu Park, legal and critical race studies scholar. In an essay titled Money, Mortgage, and the Conquest of America, Park shows how lands became liquid in colonial America. The instruments that we know as foreclosure, that we often narrate as neoliberal, that instrument, Park shows, was created by settler colonists by a bending backwards of English property law. While English property law did not treat land as chattel, colonists engaged in predatory lending practices to indigenous populations seeking to create debt and steal land, created what Park calls a brand new American commodity. By the 1670s, colonial laws instituted foreclosure in America, enabling and legitimizing the widespread expropriation of land from indigenous people, and in Park's words, turning land into real estate or the fungible commodity on the speculative market that it remains today. So if we return to Libby Porter's important question about possessory recognizability, it becomes clear that we must situate thresholds of recognition in these histories of settler colonialism and in the reactivation of colonial reason in the many socio-spatial formations of modernity: the post-colony, the plantation, the prison, the ghetto, the reservation. We're trying to undertake this kind of historical thinking at multiple sites. Along with Mukul Kumar, who just completed his PhD in urban planning at UC Berkeley, I've argued that in order to understand urban informality in India today, if we are to understand the political economy of land in India today, we have to analyze and pull apart what Asher Gertner calls the propriety of property. And we need to trace the emergence of landlordism and tenancy as social relations. Our recent essay, The Epistemology of Property, which appears in this book, Subaltern Geographies, edited by Tariq Jazeel and Stephen Legg, focuses on a British colonial apparatus, the Permanent Settlement of 1793, which created a semi-feudal system of property rights in order to ensure revenue flows for colonial corporations and regimes. If we are to spend any time on the ground in an informal settlement in India today, I can promise you that those colonial relationships of landlordism and tenancy, particularly of subtenancy and tika tenancy, are very much the socio-spatial logics at work, reactivated and re-articulated through post-colonial governance. Again, why does all of this matter? So I'm going to turn for this last bit of the talk to why the study of spatial illegalization and racial banishment matters for for what I call the political life of urban studies, the stakes that matter the most to me. And here, let me turn to some of the work we are doing at the University of California, Los Angeles, at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, at which I have the great privilege of serving as inaugural director. Launched in 2016, the Institute supports research and public scholarship concerned with dispossession and displacement in Los Angeles and in many other cities around the world. A core philosophy for us is this: the antonym of racial banishment is not integration. It is not liberal inclusion. The antonym of racial banishment is freedom. We learned this lesson from many teachers, but two in particular that I want to acknowledge this evening. The first is Robin D.G. Kelley, scholar extraordinaire, whose path-breaking book, Freedom Dreams, forms a foundation for so much of the work we do on racial capitalism. That book, Freedom Dreams, insists that we have to situate all struggles within the broader context of struggles for freedom, against slavery and against colonialism, and it grounds our efforts to advance housing justice or decarceration or debt disobedience or educational reparations in the Black radical tradition and its commitments to abolition democracy. Our second teacher is the LA Community Action Network, LA CAN, which has been working from the heart of Skid Row in Los Angeles for over 20 years, fighting for poor and housed Angelenos, and that always urges us to think about freedom. For those of you on Twitter, the hashtag that LA CAN likes to use is, as you can see, let's get free. Such freedom dreams are global in scope. They connect police violence in the inner city of Los Angeles to militarized police violence in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. They conceptualize, as did the Black Panthers in Oakland, of Fanon in the context of the Algerian independence movement, a revolutionary humanism that sees ghetto and colony as part of a world system of colonialism and imperialism, and that insists on crafting liberation through such interconnections. Put another way, there's a global geography at work in such alliances, in this critical examination of property, personhood, and police. Following Jodie Bird, I call this a world of many Souths. In her words, global and subaltern Souths, in which she includes the American South. Bird argues that the many Souths, I quote, do imaginative work for the nation state as sites of remembrance, trauma, absence, and survival. There are many inspirations for the Institute as we think about these global and subaltern Souths, but in particular today, I want to end tonight's talk by foregrounding one, which is abolition democracy. I won't go through this list of inspirations, but it gives you a sense of the theoretical and political traditions that guide our work, and in particular, I want to talk about abolition democracy as it comes out of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and more broadly the Black radical tradition, and in particular the ways in which our study of spatial illegalization and racial banishment has been shaped by the ongoing activism of our graduate students, particularly those in urban planning, who have sought to instantiate a project called Abolitionist Planning for Resistance. And this resource guide is available on our website. So, if the plantation or prison or colony are conceptual palimpsests for the city, as McKittrick would have us keep in mind, then what might it mean for abolition to be a conceptual palimpsest for urban planning and other spatially oriented disciplines and professions? Let me briefly signal two lines of inquiry and struggle that are important for us at the Institute and that speak to the geographies of dispossession and illegalization that I've outlined this evening. The first, rather obviously, is the land question. The abolitionist planning course and project comes out of a close reading that my graduate students and I did in the days immediately following Trump's election. In particular, our reading was an engagement with W.E.B. Du Bois's magisterial text, Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, with a subtitle worth paying attention to, Towards a History of the Part which Black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. An extraordinary history that is, as Cedric Robinson has noted, a theory of history. Black Reconstruction is also a vision of abolition democracy. Central to this vision is an exuberant vision of the state and the promise of reconstruction, specifically the redistribution of land once owned by slave owners to freed slaves. Those land reforms never took place in the United States. The United States is the postcolony to which postcolonialism has not arrived. But Du Bois remains hopeful. Writing in 1935, he states, "It is quite possible that long before the end of the 20th century, the deliberate distribution of property and income by the state on an equitable and logical basis will be looked upon as the state's prime function." I don't have time tonight to detail Du Bois's theory of the state, but let me just say that the state of which he dreams is built through an uprising, what he describes as the uprising of the black man. I argue then that as plantation and colony serve as a conceptual palimpsest for the city, so the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands that existed during the period of Reconstruction after the end of the Civil War can be understood as a conceptual palimpsest for the state. But, as Du Bois notes, what unfolded in the US was the counter-revolution and the counter-reformation of property. The through lines of dispossession are devastating. Just last week, The Atlantic featured a story of how 1 million black farmers were dispossessed of their land in the 20th century. The article described this as a war waged by deed of title as real estate trusts and corporate landlords grabbed land. It is crucial then to understand such loss of land as theft and to consider the politics of possessory recognizability at stake. And so if we were to follow Casey Park's genealogy of possession, that history that tells us where foreclosure comes from, we would find that so many of the towns of Massachusetts, towns such as Springfield, were grabbed and stolen. That land was grabbed and stolen by Father William Pynchon and son John Pynchon through the use of foreclosure against indigenous people. And once we know this history, what then is reconstruction? What then is reparation? I'm especially inspired by all of the growing scholarship on marronage, which shows how in the face of such dispossession of property and personhood, African Americans established maroon communities, or what brilliant urban planning scholar Andrea Roberts in this project calls freedom colonies. Her work, located in East Texas, reveals a stunning picture of freedom dreams where black settlement claimed farmland and established roots. As Roberts notes, urban planners have for the most part overlooked such unmapped freedom colonies. Here once again is a conceptual palimpsest for freedom. My final point is this, that abolitionism also requires a reconstruction of our disciplines and professions, our epistemologies, our ontologies, our ethical commitments. It requires what at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy has been a key methodology for us, what we call decolonizing the university. We see the university that we inhabit as a land-grant public university and therefore as an institution deeply embedded in the very logics of racial capitalism that we seek to dismantle. And we see all of the ways in which academic knowledge is deployed in projects of colonial harm, through extractive research, but also in propping up the relationship between property, personhood, and police. And let me give you just one example of this, because it speaks to precisely the cases I brought to your attention this evening. One of our teachers in Los Angeles is something called the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. You see their logo down here. A brilliant community organization that is able to analyze what they call the national stalker state with diagrams of power that would have made Foucault very, very jealous. The Stop LAPD Spying Coalition has noted that the various forms of illegalization and criminalization that I talked about this evening are undergirded by the police logics of state power, and in the case of Los Angeles, but also in many parts of that world, that police power is sophisticated. It relies increasingly on algorithms in the ways that the financialization of land and housing relies on algorithms, and the algorithm most used by the Los Angeles Police Department is something called predictive policing, which is precisely a form of preemptive policing that produces chronic offender bulletins that the police department uses to surveil, to police, to target, except that those on the chronic offenders list don't know that they're on that list, and most importantly, they have not committed any crimes. Predictive policing comes out of the work of a distinguished professor of anthropology at UCLA, Jeffrey Brantingham, and his private consulting firm, Predpol. Brantingham's models are based on his observations as an anthropologist of violent animal predators, which he then extends to black and brown bodies in Los Angeles, arguing in his landmark article, I quote, that criminals are effectively foragers. Choosing what car to steal is like choosing which animal to hunt. Movements like Stop LAPD Spying have therefore said to us that if we really care about abolitionist planning or decolonizing the university, we at the university have to take collective responsibility for the forms of knowledge, including the algorithms of predictive policing, that have had such devastating impact on targeted bodies and communities. What then are these material practices of solidarity and accountability that allow us to dismantle not just illegalization, but the deployment of powerful knowledge in that illegalization? And so, as we launched the endeavor of abolitionist planning, in response to it, from New York came a scathing critique penned by Dishonné Dozier, then doctoral candidate at CUNY Graduate Center. She wrote a piece saying, "There is no room for planners in the movement for abolition." She argued that the fight for abolition can never be incorporated into professional planning because planning itself is a central conduit of colonial and capitalist violence against black, brown, and indigenous bodies. She drew a distinction, though, between insurgent planners, whom she described as those who continuously put freedom into motion to turn the tide of the violence of land extraction and enslavement, and planners who get degrees and compensation from institutions of colonial harm. I found Dozier's provocations to be vitally important and urgently necessary, and we have been thinking them through at UCLA. I worry that our disciplines, especially urban planning, has made peace with violence, and we have to find a way of thinking about our role in the production, in the legal production of illegality. We at the Institute, call our refusal to make peace with violence research justice. Research justice is the reconstruction of urban planning and related disciplines and professions to play a role in the struggles for freedom and anti-colonial liberation. Most of all, it is about material practices of solidarity and accountability that bind us not just to the traditions of thought in which we've been trained, but to the communities that are on the front lines of spatial illegalization and racial banishment. Thank you.